If you grew up in Britain, you knew the sound before you knew the name, the rattle of a Swan Vestas box, the scrape, the little hiss and flare that lit the gas ring, the coal fire, the last cigarette of the night. At its height, the empire behind that flame made 45 billion matches a year, and the Garston works on the Mersey employed close to 900 Liverpudlians, most of them women. It survived the Fossey Jaw scandal and the match girls' strike. It survived the abolition of white phosphorus. It survived the Blitz, when the bombers came for the docks and the work moved inland. It survived 2 world wars and a century of mergers. And then, after more than 130 years of making, the machine stopped and Britain never made another match. How does something that survived all of that, something in every pocket in the country, simply disappear? What happened on that Liverpool dock road? Chapter 1. The Silent Works. The frontage runs for 35 bays along Speke Road, 2 stories of pale reinforced concrete, and at the head of every column sits a red Lancashire rose. The roses were the architect's quiet joke, a flower cast in stone to make each pillar resemble the thing the building made, a match struck and standing upright against the Mersey sky. Nobody strikes them here now. The water tower still stands on the roof, a squat concrete cylinder that once fed the sprinklers in case the whole place went up. A match factory lives its life one careless spark away from catastrophe, and this one was built knowing it. Today, the tower looks out over a car park, some smart glazing, the tidy signage of an award-winning office estate. People come here to work at desks. They drink coffee where the head-dipping machines once ran, and most of them have no particular reason to know what that means. Here's what it means. This was the last one. When the machines in this building powered down in December 1994, they did not simply close a Liverpool factory. They ended match manufacturing in Britain. All of it. An industry that had begun on a 3-acre site in East London in 1861, that had clothed the nation's pockets and mantelpieces for well over a century, that had survived scandal and strike and the Blitz. It stopped here, on this road, in this suburb, and it never started again. The country that had bought the patent to the safety match and sold it to the world now makes no matches at all. The name on the boxes was Bryant May, Swan Vestas, England's glory. If you're old enough, you can hear the sound already. The rattle of the box, the scrape, the little sulphur hiss and flare. For the best part of 130 years, that sound was as ordinary as breathing. It was how you lit the gas ring, the coal fire, the pipe, the last cigarette of the night. It was in every kitchen drawer in the land. And then, one factory at a time, the ordinary thing became a rare thing, and the rare thing became nothing at all. The building survived, beautifully as we'll see. But the matches didn't, and neither did the livelihoods of the people who made them. To understand how something so universal could vanish so completely, you have to go back to the beginning, to 2 devout men in Victorian London who didn't much want to make matches at all. Chapter 2. 2 Quakers and a Swedish spark. It started with groceries. In 1843, 2 Quaker merchants went into partnership over tea and general provisions on Tooley Street, in the shadow of London Bridge. William Bryant was a Plymouth man, in his late 30s, who'd come out of a soap and starch firm. Francis May was the 4th son of a wealthy London Quaker family. Neither of them was in the match trade. Neither of them, at first, wanted to be. That reluctance mattered, and it was religious. The matches of the day were lucifers, tipped with white phosphorus. They'd light on any rough surface, and they were lethal. Lethal to the workers who dipped them, whose jawbones rotted in a horror called Fossey Jaw. As Quakers, Bryant and May had a conscience about the things they sold. For years they wouldn't touch the dangerous kind. What they would touch was something new coming out of Sweden. In the early 1850s, 2 brothers, Carl and Johan Lundström, had begun making a safer match, one that only struck against a specially prepared surface, keeping the deadly phosphorus off the match head and onto the box. Bryant and May started importing them. The first order was modest, 10 or 15 cases, but the British public took to safety the way it takes to most conveniences, and within a couple of years the partners were shifting 8 million boxes a year, something close to half of everything the Lundströms could produce. Importing was good business. Owning the idea was better. In 1855, Bryant and May bought the British patent rights to Johan Edvard Lundström's safety match outright, and in 1861 they stopped being merchants and became manufacturers, opening the Fairfield Works at Bow in East London, 3 acres of former candle factory rebuilt, rather grandly, in a mock Venetian style, With 25 steam engines and its own mill turning imported Canadian pine into matchsticks, they gave the whole enterprise a trademark meant to speak of exactly the thing they'd built their conscience on: safety, security, a refuge from the flood. They chose Noah's Ark, the name, so the story goes, borrowed from a chapel that stood beside a pub of that name. The ark that kept you safe, stamped on a box of the safest matches money could buy. Hold that image, because it curdles. William Bryant died in 1874, and management passed to his son, Wilberforce Bryant, a harder and grander man than his father. Within a generation, the firm that began in Quaker scruple would be a byword for something else entirely, a name spoken in Parliament and the newspapers not as a symbol of safety, but as a symbol of exploitation. And Wilberforce himself, the pious founder's son, would end up master of Stoke Park, one of the grandest Palladian houses in England, its lawns paid for by the girls who dipped the matches. The distance between the chapel and the mansion is the distance this story travels. It doesn't take long to cover. Chapter 3. The Empire of Fire. The rise, when it came fast, and it came on the back of a simple truth about the Victorians. They needed fire, constantly, and they needed it in the palm of a hand. Everything ran on a struck match: the gas lamp, the coal range, the copper for the washing, the pipe, the candle up to bed. A household got through matches the way a modern one gets through electricity, without thinking, all day long, and Bryant and May were there to supply the flame. By 1876, the Bow Works employed around 5,000 people. By the mid-1880s, the firm was turning out something like 300 million matches a day. In 1884, they became a limited company and swallowed a rival, Bell and Black, which made them the largest matchmaker in Britain. To run the growing operation, they brought in a managing director, Gilbert Bartholomew, a sharp commercial mind who'd steer the company for the next quarter century. On paper, it was a triumph. The empire of fire, expanding by the year. But an empire built on the labour of the poor tends, sooner or later, to be asked what that labour costs. And in the summer of 1888, at the Bow factory in East London, not in Liverpool, the Merseyside chapter of this story is still decades away, the question arrived. The workforce at Bow was overwhelmingly female, around 1,400 women and girls, some of them very young, working up to 14 hours a day for wages, under 5 shillings a week. And the firm fined them. Fined them for talking, for dropping matches, for going to the toilet without permission. Sums of 3p to a shilling docked from wages that were already at the edge of survival. Overhead, the phosphorus did its slow work. The company's own records would later show 47 cases of phosphorus necrosis between 1878 and 1898, and admit that it had failed to report 17 of them, including 6 deaths. In June of that year, a campaigning journalist named Annie Besant published an article in her paper, The Link. She called it White Slavery in London, and she named the firm. Bryant and May's directors, Wilberforce Bryant among them, responded by trying to force the women to sign a paper contradicting her. When one worker was dismissed, the whole place walked out, 1,400 of them on strike. It should have been a rout for the company. It wasn't. The matchgirls organised, and they won. The fines were abolished. The Union of Women Matchmakers was formed, the largest union of women and girls in the country, and a landmark in the history of British labour. Among the strike committee was a young woman named Sarah Chapman, who would become its public face, and whose great-granddaughter would one day unveil a plaque on the very ground where the factory stood. The pious firm's darkest chapter had also lit a fire it never meant to light. Modern women's trade unionism was born, in part, in the yard of a match factory in Bow. The company weathered it, as it weathered most things. But the next threat came from a direction Bryant and May couldn't fine into silence. It came from America, and it very nearly finished them. The Diamond Match Company had a machine, a continuous, mechanized matchmaking machine that could turn out 600,000 matches an hour, and Diamond built a plant to run it just north of Liverpool, at Litherland. British hands, however skilled, couldn't compete with that kind of automation. Bryant and May faced being simply outproduced, so they made a deal that looked, at the time, uncomfortably like surrender. In the early years of the new century, they handed Diamond a controlling stake, more than half the company's share capital, in exchange for Diamond's British assets and its machines. National dominance, in other words, was not so much won as bought back at the price of the firm's own independence, and it came with a prize that would outlast everything else. Among those assets was a brand of wax match that had started life in Bootle in 1883 as Swan. In 1906, under Bryant and May, it was christened Swan Vestas, the smoker's match. Before long, the best-selling match in Britain. There was one more jewel to gather. In 1913, the company bought S.J. Morland and Sons of Gloucester, a family firm that had created a match with a label showing a great sailing warship and a name that could hardly have been more of its age. England's Glory. Bryant and May didn't invent it, they acquired it, but the ship on that box would sail in British pockets for the rest of the century. Swan Vestas, England's Glory, two names that would end up, eventually, on the last matches ever made in this country. But that ending was still a long way off. First came the works on the Mersey, and the Golden Age. Chapter 4. Garston, the match on the Mersey. To find the heart of this story, you have to leave London behind and come north, to a dock suburb in the south of Liverpool, where the timber came in off the ships and the railway sidings ran for miles. Garston in these years was a place transformed by industry. Its population had rocketed from a couple of thousand in the mid-19th century to 17,000 by 1900, a self-contained working town of bobbin works and tanneries and button factories wrapped around a busy dock. And on Speke Road, a firm called R. Bell and Company had built a matchworks back in 1887. That works was taken over after the Great War by a company with a name like a solicitor's letterhead. Maguire, Patterson and Palmer, matchmakers, founded in 1898 by men who'd learned the trade at the American Diamond Company. By 1919, only one of the founders remained active in it, Alexander Maguire, a man knighted for his part in getting the White Phosphorus Matches Prohibition Act onto the statute book, the law that finally banned the poison that had rotted the match girls' jaws. It was Maguire, Patterson and Palmer who built the thing that still stands on Speke Road today. And what they built was extraordinary, though almost nobody at the time seemed to notice. They hired the architects Muez and Davis, the practice behind the Ritz Hotel, and a structural engineer named Sven Belander. Between roughly 1919 and 1921, on that Liverpool Dock Road, they raised one of the most advanced industrial buildings in the country. It was among the very first structures in Britain to use reinforced concrete flat slab construction, a technique the Americans called mushroom framing, where the floors sit directly on flared column heads with no beams between. It made for vast, open, light-flooded floors, an American daylight factory dropped into Merseyside. It predated the celebrated Boots factory in Nottingham, the one the architecture books all praise, by the better part of a decade, and the metropolitan establishment, which fussed over such things, largely ignored it, a modernist landmark hiding in plain sight behind rows of red concrete roses. Bryant and May took over the English interests of Maguire, Patterson and Palmer in the early 1920s, and Garston became theirs. They had chosen the site with care, the rail sidings for moving matches out, the docks for bringing timber in, poplar and aspen, the pale soft woods that made the best splints and the best matchboxes, a frontage on an arterial road, and a decent distance from housing because everyone in the trade remembered what a match factory could do if the wrong spark found the wrong room. They even planted black poplars, matchbox wood, in a line along the front of the works, as if the building were advertising its own raw material. The factory was designed to hold 2,000 workers. At its mid-century height, it employed close to 900, most of them women, many of them from the streets that ran down to the docks. In Garston, they'll tell you it was the largest match factory in Europe. Nobody has ever quite been able to prove that, and nobody in Garston has ever much cared to. It was theirs, and it was enormous, and that was enough. Step inside during the good years and you'd have found something close to a small civilization. The company laid on a canteen, medical rooms, a doctor and even a chiropodist on site. There were recreation rooms, a bowling green, a tennis court, gardens. It was paternalism, certainly, the company deciding what was good for you, but to a woman raised in a dockside terrace, a warm canteen and a nurse on hand was not nothing, and the work itself had a rhythm you could set your life by. The logs came off the ships and were stripped of their bark. Machines chopped them into splints, hundreds of thousands at a time. The splints were soaked in a solution to stop them smouldering after the flame went out, then waxed, then carried to the dipping machines where each tiny head met its charge of chemicals. Then the drying, the endless drying, and the filling of the boxes, and the printing of the labels, the Swan, the sailing ship, and out to the sidings and away on the railway to every corner of Britain. The whole place smelled of it, cut wood and hot wax and the faint bite of sulphur, a smell the women carried home in their hair and their clothes and, years later, could summon up in an instant, because it was the smell of their working lives. Then, in 1941, the German bombers came for the docks, and the Litherland plant, the old diamond works up the coast, was hit. Production was pulled back and consolidated here at Garston. From that point on, this was the group's Merseyside centre, its stronghold, the place the matches came from. Nobody working those floors in the warm years could have imagined it would one day be the only place, or that only would soon become last. Chapter 5. Peak Light. By the 1930s, the empire was at its summit, and the numbers had a heft to them that's hard to credit now. In 1934, the British Match Corporation, the group Bryant May sat at the centre of, produced 45 billion matches in a single year. 45 billion. By 1935, it ranked among the largest companies in the country. Swan Vestas was the best-selling match in Britain and would stay that way for a generation, and the dominance held for a remarkably long time. As late as 1971, Bryant May still controlled something like 55% of the entire British match market. The reason was simple, and it was everywhere. Britain still ran on fire, you lit by hand. In 1974, more than half of British men still smoked. The coal fire, the gas cooker lit with a match at the ring, the pilot flame, the cigarette, the match sat at the centre of all of it, a tiny wooden hinge on which a whole way of life turned. Almost every home in the land had a box of Swan Vestas rattling in a drawer, a book of matches in a coat pocket, an England's glory ship sailing along the mantelpiece. It was as close to a certainty as a manufactured product ever gets. You could no more picture Britain without matches than without kettles, and that certainty was precisely the trap, because here is the quiet, dreadful thing about being universal. If the whole of your value rests on the fact that everyone needs you all the time, then the day people stop needing you, there's nothing left to fall back on. A company that makes many things can lose one and survive. A company that makes the one thing everyone uses has no shelter at all when the using stops. And at the very moment Garston stood at its peak, humming and full, the instruments of its undoing were already in the room. The gas cooker was learning to light itself. Electric ignition was creeping in, and in 1973, a French company would put a small plastic butane lighter on every shop counter in Britain, a thing you could buy for pennies, use for weeks, and throw away. Nobody on those Liverpool floors could see it yet. Why would they? The boxes were still going out on the railway by the million. The smell of wax and sulphur still hung in the air. The canteen still fried breakfast for the morning shift. But the peak is only ever visible as a peak from the far side of it, and Bryant May had just reached theirs. Chapter 6. The Flame Gutters. The decline of the match didn't announce itself. There was no single blow, no fire, no crash. There was simply a country slowly, quietly, ceasing to need the thing Garston made, and a company that watched it happen and understood, better than anyone, exactly what it meant. Start with the smoking, because that was the biggest thread pulled loose. In the 1970s, half of British men, and something like 4 in 10 women, reached for a cigarette. Every one of them was a customer. Every pack lit was a match struck, a box emptied, a box replaced, a small, reliable transaction repeated millions of times a day across the whole of the country. And then, decade by decade, the nation put the cigarettes down. By the 2020s, it was around 1 man in 10. That is not a dip. That is the floor falling out of a market, 1 lung at a time, and every smoker who quit took a little piece of Garston's reason to exist away with them. The genius of the match had always been that everybody needed it. Its curse was that the moment fewer people needed it, there was no half measure to retreat to. You cannot make a smaller match for a nation that has stopped smoking. Then came the thing in the pocket. In 1973, the French firm BIC, the Biro people, launched a disposable butane lighter, following a lead the American cricket brand had set the year before. It was cheap, it was reliable. You bought it for pennies, flicked it 1,000 times, and threw it away without a thought. The man behind it, Marcel Beisch, had already done the same thing to 2 other trades. He had taken the fountain pen, a thing of craft and refilling and ceremony, and replaced it with a clear plastic tube you used up and binned. He had done it again to the razor. Now he came for the flame, with precisely the same logic. Make it good enough, make it cheap, make it disposable, and let convenience do the rest. Within a few years, disposable lighters held around 2/3 of their market, and the little box of Swan Vestas, that daily companion rattling in 10 million drawers, began to look less like a necessity and more like a habit. And a habit, unlike a necessity, can be broken. The home changed too, in ways no advertising could arrest. The new gas cookers lit themselves with a pilot light or a piezo spark you pressed with your thumb. The open coal fire, that great daily consumer of matches, that thing you knelt in front of every winter morning with a box in your hand, was dying out, pushed aside by central heating and the clean air laws that were quietly clearing the smoke from British cities. One by one, the small rituals that had required a struck match were being engineered out of ordinary life. Nobody protested. Self-lighting was simply easier, and ease always wins. There was even a blow from the Treasury. For years, matches had enjoyed a kind of accidental protection. The disposable lighter carried an excise duty that kept its price up and kept the match competitive by comparison. When that duty was removed, the lighter grew cheaper still, and the match lost the one small advantage the tax code had handed it. A stroke of a pen in Whitehall, and the ground shifted a little further under Speke Road. Here is the detail that tells you the company had already done the arithmetic. Bryant May, the great matchmaker, the empire of fire itself, went into the lighter business. It made lighters. From 1981, it distributed cricket lighters across Britain, the very product that was eating its own core trade. There is no clearer confession than that. A firm that starts selling the thing killing its own product is a firm that has looked at the future, understood it completely, and decided the only way to survive the flood is to sell the flood a boat. The seeds were all in the ground now, and the strange, sorrowful thing was that not one of them had been planted in malice. There was no enemy here, only convenience and progress and the perfectly reasonable choices of millions of people who had simply found an easier way to make fire. Nobody was to blame. That was almost the worst of it. And it fell now to a series of men in boardrooms, most of them a very long way from Liverpool, to decide what to do about a business that was gently, inexorably running out of world. Chapter 7. The Men Who Closed the Box. The decisions that killed Garston were not, taken on their own, wicked. They were rational. Each one, argued in its own room on its own afternoon, could be defended by sensible people with spreadsheets in front of them. That is what makes this the particular kind of tragedy it is. Not a crime with a culprit, but a long chain of reasonable men doing reasonable things, and a factory lying dead at the end of it. The first decision was made in 1973, the same year BIC put the lighter on the counter, which tells you something about the mood in the trade. The British Match Corporation looked hard at its shrinking core and did what a well-run company is supposed to do when its main product is fading. It diversified. It bought Wilkinson Sword, the razor firm, for £19 million, took roughly half the British razor market at a stroke, and renamed itself Wilkinson Match. The logic was impeccable. If the nation is striking fewer matches, then sell it something else it reaches for every single morning. A blade instead of a flame. But watch what that decision did to the matches themselves. Overnight, matchmaking stopped being the company's reason for existing and became merely one division inside a broader consumer goods business, and not the healthy division either. Matches were now the legacy product, the sentimental old trade, the part of the portfolio the analysts frowned at and the accountants circled. And once a factory becomes a line item that the numbers no longer justify, its fate is only ever a question of timing. The Bow Works, where the entire story had begun back in 1861, had already closed in 1971, taking 250 jobs with it. Gloucester, the home of England's glory, the sailing ship itself, followed in 1975. The map of British matchmaking was being quietly folded up, town by town, factory by factory, and Garston was now one of the very few names still left on it. The second decision came from much further away, and from people with no roots in matches at all, no grandfather on the dipping line, no memory of the smell of wax. In 1978, Wilkinson Match caught the eye of Allegheny International, a conglomerate out of Pittsburgh that had grown up around American steel. Swedish Match sold Allegheny its stake in the business. By 1980, the Americans had taken full control. And to a steel and consumer goods giant in Pennsylvania, a match factory on the banks of the Mersey was not a heritage or a community or 900 families who'd organized their whole lives around its hooter. It was an asset, a unit of production to be made more efficient. So it was made more efficient. This is the part of the story that has no drama in it, and that is precisely why it did the most damage. There was no dramatic closure, no announcement, no gate slammed shut. There was automation, machine by machine, year by year. The work that had been done by hundreds of hands was handed to mechanisms that never took a break, never joined a union, never needed a canteen or a nurse or a chiropodist. The Glasgow plant at Maryhill closed in 1981, and Garston was steadily, methodically automated until by 1986 the last match factory in Britain was down to around 317 people, still capable of turning out 35 billion matches a year, but doing it with a fraction of the workforce it had once carried through the 35-bay frontage every morning. That is how a workforce of nearly 900 becomes a workforce of a few hundred, not in a single terrible headline. In a decade of quiet efficiency, each new machine perfectly justified on its own terms, each redundancy regrettable but reasonable, each Friday a few more wage packets not collected. By the time anyone thought to mourn it, most of the mourning was already overdue. The great hollowing had happened so gradually that hardly anyone noticed the building emptying around them. Then, in 1987, the wheel turned in a way nobody in Liverpool could have engineered. Allegheny International went bankrupt, the American parent collapsing under its own distant troubles, an ocean away from the Mersey. Wilkinson Match was sold, and the buyer was Swedish Match, and so it all came full circle, with an irony almost too neat to be real. The Swedish company, whose founders' safety match had started this entire British business back in the 1850s, the Lundström's invention, bought and patented and manufactured for over a century, now owned the whole of it, outright once more. More than 80% of the British match market, half its disposable lighter trade, the last match factory in the country, back in Swedish hands, where the idea had come from in the first place. Which brings us to the third decision. The final one. In 1994, Swedish Match, by now folded inside the Volvo Group, decided to close Garston and move all remaining British match production to Tidaholm in Sweden. The stated reasons were the ones we already know, and they were sound. Demand had collapsed. There was too much capacity. The excise change had wounded the trade, and it was cheaper, far cheaper, to make Britain's matches in one consolidated European plant than to keep the lights burning in a listed concrete cathedral on a Liverpool dock road. Overcapacity is overcapacity. A company is not a charity. On paper, once again, every line of it added up. Here we have to be honest about the limits of what the record can tell us. We know Swedish Match made this decision. We can name the men who ran the company in that era, but the specific executive who signed off the closure of Garston, who put his name to the end of matchmaking in Britain, does not survive clearly in any account you can reach. There is no single face for this loss, no villain seated at the head of a boardroom table. And perhaps there is a rough justice in that absence. The matches were not killed by a man. They were killed by a market, by 100 million small conveniences, and whoever signed the paper was only reading out a verdict the whole country had already delivered without meaning to. But if the corporate record is thin on names, the political record is not thin at all, because when the closure notice came, in the early weeks of 1994, one man refused to let it pass in silence. His name was Eddie Lloyden, Labour Member of Parliament for Liverpool Garston. A former merchant navy seaman and dock worker, a Liverpool man to the marrow, someone who knew exactly what it meant for a city to lose the work that had defined it, because he had watched it happen to his own. On the 19th of January 1994, he rose and tabled a motion in the House of Commons, Early Day Motion 384. And it reads, in the flat and formal language of Parliament that somehow makes it land all the harder. that this house regrets the proposal to close the Bryant May matchmaking factory in Garston, Liverpool, the last matchmaking factory in the United Kingdom, deplores the inactivity of the government, which failed to take action to protect the jobs of the Bryant May workforce, most of whom are women, condemns the government for its disregard of and failure to retain jobs on Merseyside and in particular Liverpool, and calls on the President of the Board of Trade to meet the management and trade unions of Bryant May to consider an alternative use for the Garston plant. 60 members of Parliament put their names to it, among them David Alton, Jeremy Corbyn, Dennis Skinner, Ken Livingstone, Peter Kilfoyle, Robert Parry, Bob Waring. A roll call of dissent entered into the permanent record for whoever might one day come looking, and it did nothing. The government declined to intervene. The President of the Board of Trade did not save the plant. The motion sat in Hansard, signed and dignified and entirely powerless, a formal expression of regret from 60 people who could not, in the end, shift the arithmetic that men in a Swedish boardroom had already finished working out. Market forces, it was called, and the last match factory in Britain would be permitted to die of them in a city that had already buried its docks and most of its manufacturing, in a suburb that had built itself brick by brick around the making of matches, and was now to be told, quite politely, that the making was going to Sweden. Cold logic in one country, warm human loss in another. The whole tragedy of it sits in the gap between the two. Chapter 8. The Last Box. So it ended. Production at Garston ceased in December 1994. The exact day is oddly difficult to pin down. The record settles firmly on the month and then grows vague on the date, and there is something quietly fitting in that the end of a whole British industry, and no one who thought to note down the hour. The final redundancies numbered fewer than 100. Even the count is uncertain. Some sources say 94, some say 96, and it is a small, sad irony that after 130 years of making, the last headcount cannot be stated to the single person. 2 people, somewhere, either counted or not counted, their inclusion in the record lost. What is certain is the shape of it. Fewer than 100 workers, most of them women, walking out through that 35-bay frontage for the last time, into a Merseyside winter, into an economy that had already taken the docks and had very little to offer them in return. Now set that number against the one it replaced. Nearly 900 at the height, fewer than 100 at the close. The distance between those two figures is the entire decline, measured not in pounds or in billions of matches, but in people, in the slow, patient hollowing that automation and falling demand had carried out across the years. By the time the final blow actually landed, most of the losing had already happened, quietly, without ceremony. The 1994 closure did not empty the works, it only switched off what was left. The last weeks would have felt, in most ways, like any other. The logs still came, and were stripped of their bark. The splints were still cut, hundreds of thousands at a time, and soaked in the solution that stopped them smouldering, and drawn through the wax. The heads still met their charge of chemicals on the dipping line, the same process, refined over more than a century, that turned a sliver of poplar into fire in the hand. The boxes were still filled and printed with the Swan and the sailing ship. The only difference was that everyone on the floor now knew there would be no boxes next year, that the thing their hands had done for 30 years, some of them, was about to become a thing that Britain no longer did at all. And then the machines were switched off. A factory that has run for the best part of a century has a sound. Not just the machinery, the movement of people through it, the ventilation, the low, constant hum of a place at work. A sound so continuous the workers stopped hearing it years ago. When that stops, the silence that takes its place is not an empty silence. It is a silence in the wrong shape. It fills a space that was built and braced and designed for noise, and it sits there wrong. Bryant and May Limited, the name that ran all the way back to 2 Quaker grocers on Tooley Street in 1843, past the Match Girls and the Blitz and the Empire of Fire, was renamed Swedish Match Limited. The signature was changed on the paperwork in an office somewhere, and that was how it ended, in the end. Not with a fire, not with a crash, with a filing. And in Tidaholm, in Sweden, the machines that would now make Britain's matches ran on. They took sustainably grown aspen and turned it into little wooden sticks, tipped and dried and boxed, ready to be shipped back across the North Sea to the country that had, until that December, made its own. The water tower stood over an emptying car park. The red concrete roses looked down on a road where no more lorries came to load. 133 years after the first match was struck at Bow, and 73 years after the great works had risen on Speke Road, Britain stopped making matches. It has not made one since. Chapter 9. What the Silence Keeps. For a while, the building simply stood there, empty, derelict, a vast, beautiful, useless thing on a Liverpool dock road, too grand to knock down, too specialised to use, too far from anything to matter to anyone. Windows went, weather got in. For several years, it was exactly what the hook of every one of these stories promises: the silent works, testifying to what was lost. And then, slowly, it was saved. Not as a factory, as something else. In 1998, the works was given Grade 2 listed status. The architectural establishment, finally, belatedly, putting on paper what Mewes and Davis and Sven Bylander had built there 3/4 of a century before and had been ignored for. The site was taken up within a regeneration program, and between the late 1990s and the mid-2000s, the developer Urban Splash, working with the architects Shed KM, turned it into something genuinely remarkable. They called it the Matchworks. They threaded new mezzanine floors into the building by drilling steel rods straight through the original concrete columns, the very flat slab columns that had made the place a pioneer in the first place, put back to work holding up a new century. And they added a glittering glazed pavilion beside it, which they named, with a smile that the founders might even have liked, the Matchbox. Today, it is an award-winning office estate, well over 200,000 square feet of workspace, busy and bright and admired, full of people at desks who light nothing all day. The building lives. That much of this story has a genuinely happy ending, and it would be churlish to pretend otherwise. The concrete cathedral was not lost, only its purpose was. But look south, to London, to where the whole thing began, and the contrast tells you something worth sitting with. The old Fairfield works at Bow, where the match girls struck in 1888, where the Empire started in 1861, closed in 1979 and became the Bow Quarter, a gated development of luxury flats. One-bedroom apartments there now sell for sums that would have bought the entire street outright when matches were still being made in it. Bow became a place for people with money to live. Garston became a place to work. The dockside suburb kept working, in the end, just not at matches. The women who made those matches are harder to find now than the building that housed them. There is no plaque on Speke Road naming a single one of them. No roll of the fewer than 100 who walked out that December. No monument to the nearly 900 at the height. The match girls of Bow, at least, have their memorial. A plaque unveiled in 2022, with Sarah Chapman's own great-granddaughter doing the honours. A direct line of family reaching back across more than a century to that summer strike. The women of Garston have the building and the memory, and not a great deal else. Their story survives mostly in the shape of the place they worked, and in whatever their sons and daughters still carry of the particular smell of wax and sulphur that came home, every evening, in their mother's hair and clothes. Britain makes no matches, but Swan Vestas endures, the box barely altered, the swan still swimming across the front of it, made now in Sweden from Swedish wood and sold in British shops to the few who still reach for a match instead of a lighter or a spark or a phone torch held over a birthday cake. England's glory ship still sails on its label. The name's outlived the making by decades. They may well outlive it forever, and the match itself outlived its own necessity in one last way, as memory, as image, as the small cameo that turns up exactly where you don't expect it. A box of Swan Vestas was found among the effects of George Mallory, high on Everest, in 1924. A half-burned Vesta is the clue that cracks a Sherlock Holmes case. A box, thinly disguised as duck matches, sits on the shelf in a Wallace and Gromit film, lighting a rocket to the moon. The struck match had become one of the quiet, universal punctuation marks of British life, so ordinary that nobody thought to record it, so constant that we only noticed it properly once it had gone. Strike one now, if you can still find one to strike. Feel the little scrape, the drag of the head across the sandpaper, the sulphur catching and flaring in your hand. That small sound, the hiss, the flare, the drift of smoke, was the sound of 130 years of Liverpool labour, of Quaker fortunes and match-girl courage, of a modernist masterpiece hiding all its life behind rows of concrete roses on a road down by the docks. It was made here once, all of it. And then the country simply stopped needing to strike a match. And so, one quiet December, in a building too fine to fall, the last flame in the empire of fire went out.